Hello and welcome everyone. My name is Erin Slegata Smith, and this is a channel where we like to talk about writing, learning, and creating. Today is a writing-based video where we're going to talk about why you need to watch your language. Now, this title is tiny bit clickbaitish because people like to get fired up about whether or not you can have profanities in your books, but that is actually not the topic of discussion today. Today, I'm actually wanting to talk about how we have a tendency to integrate way too much jargon into our stories, and we need to be careful about that for several reasons. So let's get into that. So, jargon is when we have this very specific language that comes from a specific field or a specific topic that people within that field or within that topic will understand what you were talking about, but people outside that field might not know. And there are quite a few reasons why this tends to sneak its way into our writing. And one of the big reasons why is because of the field that you work in. Very often, if not for most everybody, we have to have jobs other than just writing in order to support ourselves financially. And sometimes those are very jargon laden fields. And so, because we are spending our days steeped in this type of discourse and this type of discussion, then it tends to leak out into our writing. And we need to be a little bit careful about that. And one of my favorite examples for why actually comes from a professor that I had of a creative writing course back in my bachelor's degree, which was not creative writing, but I took the course and it was fun. But anyway, she gave an example from a story that a student had written for her at one point for her class. And in that story, there is a character who sees another character, and they're sitting in a chair and they're heaving, and she goes, SOB. Now, some of us think of SOB as a very different term than how that writer intended it. That writer was in a nursing program, and SOB stood for shortness of breath, which is probably different than what some of us had go through our brains because we are not steeped in that language. We're not steeped in that jargon. I come from teaching. My other job is that I am a teacher. There is a crazy amount of jargon that is used daily in teaching that doesn't translate very well into non-teaching circles. So it would be very easy for me to let different things slip into my videos that I'm making here, as well as my actual writing, that would end up creating a wall between myself and my audience because I'm using language that they're not used to, that they don't understand, or that they're going to interpret differently because they come from another field that uses very similar acronyms or terms. A funny non-teacher related one is the acronym ARC, A-R-C. Now, when I first got introduced to these letters, I knew of them as Adult Rehabilitation Center. But those of us very steeped in the writing community might know it better as Advanced Reader Copy. So, whether you are in a writing field, a teaching field, or any other kind of field, your jargon is not going to translate to everybody else. So, you need to be careful about when that happens in your writing. When you are using very jargon related terms in your writing, you need to think about, will your reader understand what it is, or how can you provide them the information that they need to understand what it is? So, for instance, maybe the character in your story comes from that very field that jargon also comes from, and it would make sense for your character to use that language because they're in that field. So, in that case, don't avoid it completely, but do use it intentionally and make sure that there's a way to clue in your audience to what that jargon means in a way that doesn't make them feel like you're belittling them for not knowing or info dumping information that they don't really need to know. So it can be a little bit of a delicate balance, but it is an important one to make because it will completely rip your reader right out of your story if you're using all sorts of language all over the place that they are unfamiliar with. Which kind of slip slides us into the second main reason why jargon shows up in our writing, which is that most writers have inadvertently become researchers, whether we intended to or not, because very often we are going to be writing things about information that we don't really have in our personal backgrounds. And I'm talking about like combat experience, historical setting related issues, and things like that. So, in those circumstances, in order to make sure that there is a certain level of realism to your story, you need to make sure that you do the research to properly portray that historical setting, what that combat experience would be like, what those injuries are like, because we don't need our characters to have protagonist armor by giving them injuries that they could never actually sustain and survive. So, we have to research to make sure we don't make these big mistakes. So, when we do that, sometimes we get a wee bit excited about it, and we are so fascinated by the information that we found that we just want to share with everyone. And then it just kind of winds up in the story that we are writing. But we need to be careful about that, because you might be super excited about your research and it may be relevant to what you were writing about in the sense that it needs to be in your story in some way. But you don't need to write a dissertation of your research that you've been doing in your book. And whether that shows up as like a crazy block of text or just like over information in individual sentences, we need to watch out for that, because once again, that will rip your reader right out of your story, and we don't want to break the immersive experience that they're having. We want them to enjoy the story, to be involved with the story. And when we use this overbearing language, it tends to take them out of the story, which is totally not what we're trying to do. We're just excited and we want to share what we learned. I get it. So, how can we start removing some of this overbearing jargon from our writing? The first thing that we are going to do is edit. Editing does so much for your story besides just check for grammar and spelling errors. You need to do so many levels of editing in order to make sure that your story is good. And one of those levels needs to be a language check. Look for the places where you are using language that is very field specific or specifically heavily related to research that you had to do in order to make sure that your story was as realistic feeling as possible. You need to figure out if those terms are actually useful to your story, how you are handing that to your reader, and whether you really need to have it in your plot. And if you don't need it, it is time for the snip snip. Cut that right out, because you don't want to have anything that's going to weigh down your story unnecessarily. It can be a little difficult to find these pieces of information because we can go brain blind. I don't think that's an actual term, but we can go brain blind to it where like you're so familiar with it that you don't realize that it's happening and you just kind of skip by. That's one of the reasons why you have to have more than one person, more than just yourself, editing your work, because you know what it's supposed to be like. So in your brain, it comes across nice and clear, but it doesn't always come across as clear to other people. So first, you need to go through yourself, try to find those places where you are particularly applying that research or where you might have used that jargon, go through, weed it out, and then once again, you're going to need to get somebody else to also read your work so that they can find the things that you might have missed because you've gone brain blind to it. On top of that, when you find the information, sometimes it is important to keep it in because, once again, you have characters in that field, and so you are trying to apply it in a way that it will be accessible to the reader, doesn't break their immersion, and still fits what you're doing with the character. And that can be a little bit harder to do, to describe in a very general, broad brushstroke kind of way, like what I'm trying to do here, because it's very specific. But essentially, what you are going to be looking for in order to determine what needs to stay is, does it fit the character for this piece of information, this specific vocabulary to be in the story? Does it enhance the plot in any way? Does it serve a function in moving the plot forward? If you can't answer yes to those questions, then you don't really need that terminology in your story. You should get rid of it, maybe replace it with something else, but you definitely won't need it. If you can answer yes to a few of those questions and no to others, then you're going to have to try to weigh that out and see how important it really is. But you definitely need to be more on the yes side of all three of those questions in order to justify keeping that in. Also, then you need to look at how you explain that information to your reader. Do you give contextual explanation where the character is acting out something that shows how this principle functions? Or are they teaching someone else how to do something and that's why it gets brought up? Try to avoid that one a little bit because it can get a little overdone very often. The ways that we introduce different plot elements and different context elements like that is through like a teaching method, which is not like it's not bad, but it gets overdone. So just sparingly. We are just sprinkling the little salt. You don't want tons of salt; it will ruin it, but you need a little bit. So consider that. So that's all I really have for you today. Thank you very much for joining in. I really appreciate the community that we're starting to build here together. We're still a wee little group, but it is growing and I'm so excited for that. I am so excited to hear more of your thoughts on things. So absolutely leave something in the comment section below about jargon, either that you have to watch out for yourself because your field is focused on that jargon, or a funny story like what I had from my creative writing class when jargon went wrong. I think that would be a lot of fun to hear those stories. So other than that, just have a great one until the next one.